there are various incarnations of why the CO2 shouldn't count. But the main reason that they tend to use is the trees are growing somewhere argument. Yes, we know we're burning trees here, over here, but those trees over there are still growing and sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. And as long as there's net growth on the landscape, we don't have to count the CO2 that's coming out of the smokestack, even though it's more CO2 per megawatt of electricity generated than if you were just burning coal. Now, this is a bogus argument. It violates physical reality. You don't get to just wish away carbon. The fact that the trees are growing somewhere else, they were already growing somewhere else. They were
Really?
already sequestering carbon. Therefore, there's obviously a net addition of CO2 to the atmosphere. And it is warming the climate just like fossil CO2.
Mary, welcome to the Accidental Gods podcast. How are you and
Thanks so
where
much
are
for
you?
having me.
You're welcome. How are you and where are you? I don't know where you are in the world.
I am in Massachusetts,
Okay.
USA,
Yep.
and I am doing great because things have really turned around politically here in the
Yeah.
last week or so. So we're all feeling a
I'm
bit
feeling
more
happier.
hopeful. And
It's amazing. The euphoria is even reaching over to the UK. I've started reading the Daily Kos again, which haven't done since the Obama election. It
okay, yeah,
feels like
stay away from
everything has turned around.
it's
It's
very central.
so before we got into anything else, I hadn't intended this, but who would your pick for vice president be? Do you have one?
I'm a big fan of Josh Shapiro and Pete
Okay.
Buttigieg,
Okay.
but
All right.
I suspect it'll be Mark Kelly,
Waltz.
which
Oh, do you?
yeah,
Okay, I was seeing a lot of
and
movement
he's
from
great
Waltz.
too. He'll be
Okay.
great. There's a
There's a
lot of
whole
deep bench.
okay. There's a whole movement on Twitter for Pete Buttigieg, who
Yeah.
I thought would be such an exciting ticket, but I can't see it really going down with the middle world so well. He does seem everyone seems to think he's going to be president at some point because he's just such an intelligent. He speaks something like 7 languages,
Yeah.
and he's just a genuinely nice guy. It's wow.
Yeah.
Anyway, he's a good. I assume it looks to me from the long distance of the other side of the Atlantic like he's a good Secretary of State for Transport. Anyway, by the time this goes out, we'll know who
That's right.
the VP is. So we'll find out who was right. Alrighty, so we're here today because I heard you on the Economics for Rebels podcast talking about the utter iniquities and the wholesale corruption that exists in the world of burning trees and other lumber to produce what is laughably called renewable and net zero power. And the depth of inequity really shocked me. And I wanted to bring you on so that people who listen here can find out and just so we can bury into it a bit more deeply. So at the start, you are the director of a think tank called the Partnership for Policy Integrity, which is absolutely the best name for any think tank I can possibly imagine because nobody is going to sit opposite you in any meeting and go, well, we don't want integrity in our policy. That's just never going to be a thing. So first of all, yay for good naming. I'm always impressed when the language is right. And tell us how it came into being and how you came to be a director, and then we'll narrow down into what it's actually doing now. Over to you.
I started working on biomass issues here in Massachusetts when I had moved back here after a long time away. And I first founded it wasn't really an NGO, it was just more of an ad hoc group, um, the Massachusetts Environmental Energy Alliance. And working on bioenergy and then realizing that actually there was so much going on nationally. And so there was a need to work on it nationally. So I decided to found PFPI as kind of a platform for that work. But I started out working on actually water withdrawal permit for a biomass plant that was proposed here in Massachusetts that was going to withdraw 880,000 gallons of water a day just for cooling. I mean, it's basically the same technology as a coal plant. And it
But
bur
880,000 gallons per day, that would presumably just dry up any river. That's an
Well,
extremely
not
quantity of water.
necessarily, but certainly during low flow periods it would. And so I started working on that and quickly realized that it's like, wait a minute, they're treating wood burning as carbon neutral, which is insane. So, going from what I thought was just kind of this niche little issue here in Massachusetts to realizing that this was being incentivized all over the US and then soon, starting to work internationally. So I founded PFPI. I mean, I started working on the issue in 2008 and I founded PFPI at the end of 2009. Um, and
Right.
have been working internationally and in the US ever since on this. So, and my background is I have a PhD in ecosystem ecology and I worked on water, carbon, nutrient relations of plants and soils. So, the segue into working on carbon flux made sense. So, excuse the
How did
cat.
that original water extraction, did you manage to stop that from happening?
We got them to improve the permit a lot. And then because of rules that we got enacted here in Massachusetts that took subsidies away from large scale electricity only plants, that plant never got built. And
Oh,
so,
well
um,
done.
yeah.
Right. Right. Interesting. Has that reverberated around the US? Are there other similar plants that were planned and that equally have not been built?
Um, there's no other state that did what Massachusetts did was, they put in place basically science-based rules that acknowledged that burning wood emits more net carbon than burning fossil fuels. And because of that finding, it was a state commission study. Because of that finding, the state decided to eliminate subsidies based on the scientific finding, which, obviously we would have loved to have replicate that. Now other states have restricted bioenergy. For instance, New York State has some restrictions on bioenergy as renewable energy, but we are still kind of tackling the problem, trying to get a more science-based carbon accounting approach everywhere. And in fact, just this morning, I was working on a set of response comments to the Internal Revenue Service here in the US, are going to grant clean energy tax credits.
Okay,
We
part of
already
the
have
IRA.
a tax credit program, but they're revamping the program. It'll give, a tax benefit to solar, wind, this kind of thing, but they've soliciting comments on whether and how bioenergy should be counted as clean energy, which for so many reasons it shouldn't.
Right.
But they are actually proposing to do carbon accounting and count all the emissions. I mean, the thing with bioenergy, as you probably know by now, is that it's treated as having zero emissions. It's treated as not necessarily carbon neutral under every schema, but it's treated as having zero emissions in many policies, even though the science and the facts are clear. There's no ambiguity about the fact that burning carbon emits a lot of carbon dioxide or
Right.
burning wood, excuse me. And so when you burn wood for energy, you actually emit more CO2 at the smokestack than when you burn fossil fuel.
Because
And
it's less concentrated. Because coal is essentially fossilized wood. It's
that's
just
right.
that
Yeah.
unfossilized wood has more mass, and you need to burn
Well,
more
it
to get the
has
same amount of
and it
power
has
out.
generally more water content, so that
Yeah.
reduces the efficiency of combustion. So there's just less for every unit of carbon that is pumped out into the world, it's generating less energy,
Okay.
less
And
useful energy.
how do the people who do the fancy accounting, are they trying to tell everyone that the trees have absorbed X amount of carbon, we are only releasing the same X amount of carbon, and therefore there's a neutral cycle? Is that the argument? And can you unpick why it isn't correct?
Well, sometimes they do make that argument, but you can always point out to them that coal already absorbed the carbon too. So the fact that the carbon was absorbed in the past is not the issue. The issue is what happens when you burn it,
Right.
and you're obviously emitting CO2 to the atmosphere. So the question is, um, can that CO2 be offset in some way through the forest regrowing,
Right.
which obviously takes a lot of time. So the argument that the bioenergy industry has used and many policies, including in Great Britain and the EU, but particularly Great Britain,
Mm.
and I know this because I'm actually involved in a legal suit against the UK government right now. So I'm very
Okay.
familiar with
Would like
their
to know more
reasoning.
about that in a minute. Go on.
Yeah. So basically, it's there are various incarnations of why the CO2 shouldn't count. Yes, yes, yes. We know it's emitting a lot of CO2, but it's not really warming the atmosphere. It's not really additional CO2 that we're emitting to the
Right.
atmosphere because of the following reasons. And all of those reasons are bogus. But the main reason that they tend to use is my shorthand for it is the trees are growing somewhere argument. Yes, we know we're burning trees here, over here, but those trees over there are still growing and sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. And as long as there's net growth on the landscape, we don't have to count the CO2 that's coming out of the smokestack, even though it's more CO2 per megawatt of electricity generated than if you were just burning coal. Now, this is a bogus argument. It violates physical reality. You don't get to just wish away carbon. The fact that the trees are growing somewhere else, they were already growing somewhere else. They were
Really?
already sequestering carbon. Nothing about cutting down and burning trees over here makes those trees over there grow faster and sequester carbon more quickly. Therefore, there's obviously a net addition of CO2 to the atmosphere, and it is warming the climate just like fossil CO2. So
Right.
this idea, this fake idea underpins a lot of policies, including that of the UK.
It's also really hard to argue when net forest cover is falling. So there may be trees growing somewhere, but there aren't nearly as many trees growing as when the trees that we just cut down for fuel were growing. You know,
Well, forests can be expanding in terms of their aerial extent,
right? But they're not,
and
are they?
even the
Or are
amount of well, in some places they are because don't forget that, like, in the early part of the 1800s, 1900s, here in the U.S., for instance, entire landscapes were cleared of trees for agriculture and wood use. So forests are actually still rebounding in some places from that
okay,
clearing.
okay,
But the rate at which forests are taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it. So basically, to simplify the whole system, you've got to think about carbon being in two pools. It's either embodied in a product or a tree or in soils. It's physical, carbon, or it's in the atmosphere or it's atmospheric carbon that's dissolved in water.
okay.
And
Yeah, it's
so
part of the
so
carbon cycle, basically.
right. But the size of those two pools is very much a function of obviously how much carbon we're emitting out of smokestacks and tailpipes and that kind of thing, but also how fast and how much carbon trees are sequestering out of the atmosphere and converting into wood. So it is totally possible for forests to be expanding in terms of their aerial extent, and yet for the rate of carbon uptake
Right.
per year to be decreasing because forests may be expanding, but they're getting thinner. They're being logged so intensively that
Okay.
the aerial extent of forests doesn't reflect their full carbon holding capacity.
So an aerial extent of a forest is an aerial view from a satellite or a plane that says we have
Aerial,
this many acres of forest,
right.
but actually the
How much
density of the
area?
trees. Right.
Yeah.
And
AEREAL, not
okay. Okay. And
IAL.
is this a measurement that is legally used as a international scale for how much forest there is? Is this the kind of metric that we use?
It is one metric that's
Okay.
tracked by international, like the FAO tracks forest cover, for instance. And you will
Okay.
sometimes hear apologists for bioenergy industry saying, "Oh, but forests are expanding. We have more forests than we've had in years."
Oh,
And it's like, well, that's nice, and we want more forests, but that doesn't mean that forests are mitigating climate the way that they should be.
right.
And in fact, because forests are taking up less and less carbon each year, they're actually acting as less effective carbon sinks
Right.
than they were previously. And in fact, in Europe, what we see is that some countries have lost their carbon sink altogether. Their forests are now a net source of carbon to the atmosphere instead of a net sink of carbon. And we see this in countries that have had a lot of forests exploited for bioenergy.
Whoa. And so I had heard that Brazil, the Amazon, was becoming a net emitter rather than a net sink. I hadn't realized it was happening elsewhere. My my framing of that was in the Amazon. This was in the Bolsonaro years. They were just basically clear cutting and burning on site in order to be able to grow soya to feed American industrial feedlots. What's happening? First of all, is that true? And second, what's happening in Europe? Are they just selectively cutting and thinning out the trees to such an extent that the biophysical reality of the ecosystem of the forest is being compromised? Or is it just that they're just felling and there's not as much forest as there was?
Well, because of the way forest is classified under these international schemes, you can clear cut a forest, so there's not a single tree standing, but it still gets counted as forest in terms
Mhm.
of area
What?
because it hasn't been converted to some other land use.
Oh dear
If you
Lord.
convert forest to agriculture, that's considered land use change, and that's a big no-no. But if you cut down a forest completely and then just let it regrow or replant it, or even, God forbid, convert a natural forest to a plantation forest, that's still counted as forest.
Right.
So
Right.
the dynamics of what's happening in Europe is obviously quite complicated because there's a bunch of different countries that have different different amounts of forest,
Right.
density of forest, all this sort of thing, different intensity of harvesting due to forest industry. But in Europe, more than half the wood that's cut out of forests is burned for energy. And it's all counted. Even burning in your fireplace is counted as renewable energy in the EU and in the UK, by the way. So when you hear, oh, we're doing so great, we're generating so much renewable energy. In fact, a
Right.
huge amount of that renewable energy comes from burning trees and other wood.
Right.
And it's decreased carbon forest standing stocks enough in some countries like Estonia and Finland, two very heavily forested countries, have both lost their forest carbon sinks.
Good God. Whoa. And I was listening to a podcast the other day where they were pointing out the new incoming Labour government wants to build 1.5 million homes in the UK, and they were arguing for timber as a building resource because it's much, much better. You're locking the wood into the building in many ways better than concrete. But there's not going to be the timber. At the moment, I gathered from that we are a net importer from Sweden of timber because we're not growing enough to build stuff with. But if we're burning it, we can't build with it. Is it the same quality of wood that we end up building? Could we build with the wood that we are currently burning? Or is it different kinds of wood?
Just possibly. I mean, it would be better to turn wood into long-lived wood products than to burn it, obviously, because it does lock up the carbon for longer. But the idea that replacing concrete and steel with wood is going to provide a real climate mitigation is also based on some false assumptions.
Okay, can you just talk us through that just for my own interest? Because I was quite
Yeah.
taken by this. It seemed quite a good idea.
Well, there's no question that um, whatever we're harvesting now, the more of what we're harvesting now that can be turned into long-lived wood products instead of burning it, that's better. There's no
Okay.
question that's better. But the idea that we can continue to harvest more and more and more to replace carbon and carbon intensive materials like steel and concrete is
Right.
fallacious because you're just you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're moving carbon around to different pools, but you're not increasing the amount of carbon that's taken out of the atmosphere and stored in forests. It's very important to remember. I mean, people say, "Oh, young trees grow faster and they suck carbon out of the air faster." But the important thing to remember is that existing forests represent big standing stocks of carbon that is now held out of the atmosphere.
Right.
When you cut down trees to turn them into long-lived wood products, very often relatively small amount of that tree actually ends up, maybe 10 to 15%, sometimes more, but very often just 10 to 15% of the wood from that tree ends up in a long-lived wood product. The rest of it ends up in the atmosphere in short order, like 2 years. It's either
Wow.
burned for energy or it's turned into a short, like paper
Okay.
stuff disposed of and then burned, incinerated as waste or potentially landfilled. But
But then it becomes methane, which is even worse.
some of it, landfilled wood doesn't actually turn into methane that fast.
Okay.
It
Okay.
stays stored for a long time, but we can't just, that's not the answer either.
No.
Like,
Okay.
putting wood in landfills, or there are actually these harebrained schemes to bury wood as climate
I'm
mitigation.
sorry. What?
Yes,
Talk us through that.
this what's that's being proposed now is so bonkers. We're going to cut down trees and bury them or sink them in the ocean. What? So that they don't decompose and they just represent carbon that's locked up.
That's
This is just,
functionally insane.
it's just
But you don't
totally,
need to cut them. You could, I mean, if you want more trees, you just grow more trees. It's not like we're short of land on which you could grow trees, to be perfectly frank. You just take a
actually,
few
in some
sheep off
ways
and let some trees grow.
we are short on land because population is growing and the need for food is increasing. And so, you always hear about, oh, we're going to grow plantations of trees on abandoned land.
Mm.
But there's such abandoned land. I look around. I mean,
Well,
um,
I live in an area where there's lots of what we call sheep wrecked land, and if you took the sheep off, which frankly are not feeding very many people, you could grow a lot of trees.
right. Well, you could grow more trees, but if you're then cutting them down to turn them into products, and they're not really storing
No,
carbon.
okay. Right,
So,
right.
I mean, there's definitely a super important role for rewilding and bringing forests back, and it needs to be done properly. It shouldn't be done with plantations. It should be done with
Mm,
forests that are as natural as possible, with a variety of species, and
exactly.
because we need to
Increasing
restore.
biodiversity, because that's also, we're in a
Right.
biodiverse crisis as well.
Exactly. Exactly. But the idea, basically, the idea is of the bioeconomy, which is kind of the shorthand word for the idea that we're going to replace carbon intensive anything, fossil fuels, steel, concrete for building with wood. That idea is based on some big assumptions that turn out to not really be met in reality. And when you really look, it's pretty simple. The more carbon that we can pack into forests, the better for the climate.
Okay,
And
okay,
all of this is really designed, it's all part of a framework of thinking that we can just continue to consume indefinitely
sure.
and that we can support the way we live now, but just shift to other resources instead of fossil fuels or steel or concrete. We're just going to use wood and we're just going to carry on as normal. But it doesn't work that way. The carbon math does not work. And
No,
the nice thing about increasing carbon density of forests is that existing forests actually are quite thinned out because they've been exploited so heavily. So you actually could store a lot more carbon in forests without claiming other land and putting forests on it. You could
okay,
just increase the carbon density of existing forests by taking the logging pressure off,
okay.
reduce logging pressure, let trees get bigger.
More mother trees. That would be really good. And then you also then have the ecosystem building back to an ecosystem. You presumably you build soil, which also sequesters carbon. You actually get
Exactly.
that the whole cycle
Yeah.
growing back in again.
Yeah.
So let's unpick the pressures to not do this, because one of the things that has really struck me reading through your website and the associated ones is the extent to which this false accounting is an integral part of government policy. That they like being able to say Drax is zero emissions. We're producing all this power with zero emissions when quite plainly there's actual smokestacks pumping carbon into the
Right.
sky. How do they get so that moderately sane people somewhere up the tree, and not necessarily the people at the top, certainly not when these decisions were made, but there are some people who have the capacity to think in in the whole structure. How do they end up being bamboozled into believing that this is the case?
Oh, I wish I knew.
Okay.
I think that they do understand what's really going on. And they are just I think Drax is basically just run I mean, in the case of Drax in particular,
So tell
they've
me what
just got
Drax is, because not everyone listening will
right.
will have a clue.
Well, Drax is this huge power station, up in Yorkshire that is responsible for something like 6 or 7% of the UK's electricity generation. And a number of years ago, they started to switch from burning, coal, burning wood pellet. And now they've completely converted over to wood pellets. And the wood pellets that they burn are sourced mostly from North America, so from the USA and Canada.
From old
Yeah.
growth forests.
Yeah, old growth forests, some forests that are old but not classified technically as old growth, and then even primary forests, meaning forests that were never logged ever until drugs came along.
No.
So this is
How is that
happening.
even legal? How are you allowed to log primary forest in this day and age?
Well, you're sort of not supposed to, but Canada has has left the door open for this kind of thing, and Drax has just gone right through that doorway. So, I mean, basically, well, Drax diversified into not only buying pellets from other companies, but they started building and purchasing pellet plants themselves. So they built several in the U.S. and then they purchased a company called Pinnacle Pellets in Canada.
Okay, there
And
is
so
steam now
those,
coming out of my
yeah.
ears.
So the BBC did a great expose on this. And I can send you,
Please
if you
do.
do show notes, I can send you a link
Yes,
for
you
the
should have. Yes.
Vimeo version of that. They did an expose on the logging that's happening. It's only 29 minutes long, and it's such a fantastic piece of
Yeah, I will
reporting.
definitely put that in the show notes. But
Um,
then people
yeah,
know then. Because I have a report from, we're recording towards the end of July. I have a report from last Friday that Drax reported an increase in profit in the first half and forecast that its earnings for the full year would come out at the top end of expectations. It now has pre-tax profits of £463 million in the first half of the year, up from 338 million in the same period last year. And they're getting something ridiculous like 3 million per day in subsidies from our
yeah,
government, which frankly could be spent on almost anything else and it would be worth. This government
yeah.
today has announced that it is cutting all winter fuel payments to pensioners, which is what keeps them warm in the winter because it hasn't got
Wow,
enough money. Now, leaving aside that this is economically illiterate and it is the government's job to spend the money, and they
that's
can point out to
shocking.
me what, how much of that money they spend would they not get back as tax? And frankly, the bits they wouldn't get back as tax is the bits they're giving to Drax. Sorry. Big rant.
Yeah.
I'm so
Well,
angry.
that's really shocking. So yeah, so the 20 the Drax's annual financial report from 2022 has a table in it that shows that if you add up their contracts for difference and their renewable obligation payments, so some of the subsidies work in different ways. Like they're not all just direct payments, but basically they all are obviously funded with public money. And the total is definitely more than £3 million per day that they get as a public benefit, or at least that year. I don't know what the current number is. So, it's it's shocking amount of money, and
That's over
yeah,
a billion a year in public subsidies. It's not surprising they're making a profit for their shareholders.
yeah,
They're about to do a share
yeah.
buyback
The
scheme,
majority
which
of
is
their
the ultimate gift.
profit comes from the payments that are basically from the public. So, yeah, and all of this in the name of reducing emissions when it's actually increasing emissions. If they were burning coal, they would be emitting less CO2 and they wouldn't be destroying forests, which
Oh,
they are
quite.
now. So, yeah, we would love to see the UK government do better on this issue, and maybe the new government will. In the meantime, my organization PFPI works closely with a UK charity known as the Lifescape Project. And Lifescape is mostly a rewilding charity, but we teamed up to form something called the Forest Litigation Collaborative. And
Right.
they bring the law and I bring the science. And together we've teamed up to bring legal cases on forests, climate, and bioenergy all over the place. We helped bring cases in Japan, or sorry, Korea. We helped
Oh,
bring cases in. We're working on some stuff in Estonia right now, and we have this case where we've helped sue the European Commission over the financial taxonomy, which treats bioenergy and forest activities as green, eligible for green financing. And then we have this case against the UK government against on the biomass strategy. And
right.
basically the biomass strategy is more of this bogus carbon accounting saying bioenergy is zero emissions and therefore we're going to continue supporting it. And they're making a decision. The conservative government was on the verge of making a decision, which was suspended pending the election,
Okay.
about extending subsidies for Drax. Drax is now claiming that they used to say, oh, we're carbon neutral. We have no emissions to the atmosphere, no net emissions to the atmosphere. Now they're saying that they're going to use carbon capture and storage to take the carbon that was coming out of the smokestacks from burning wood and compress it and bury it underground. And that if they do this, that this constitutes negative emissions. So they're
No.
pretending
No.
that they're stopping emissions that were going into the atmosphere before actually represents drawing down emissions and sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. They're calling this negative emissions. And so the government has somewhat fallen for this and had a consultation on it, to which we responded.
Okay.
Um, yeah. So
Are they
we
likely to
would like
listen
to see
to you?
the Labor government just, you know, put a kibosh on continued subsidies for Drax.
Okay. So a whole number of questions arise from there. First of all, carbon capture and storage always struck me a little bit like nuclear fusion. It's always been at least 10 years away. And we're not any closer. And I'm sure the AI is going to solve for nuclear fusion at some point in the future, but I'm not holding my breath. So, have they got actual working carbon capture and storage? That's the first question. Is it actually functional? And second, what is the energy return over energy invested? Because it isn't no energy to capture carbon. And if what you're doing is running a power station in order to create the energy, in order to capture the carbon with which you are in order to capture the carbon that you're producing from your power
Right.
station, then the whole thing just needs to stop. Do you
Yeah.
happen to know the EROI of the carbon capture and storage, or
I
is it just a fancy thing that the unicorns are sprinkling fairy dust and it'll happen in the future?
my understanding is that it requires and I don't remember it's off the top of my head. I don't want to say an exact number because I don't remember
Okay,
what it is.
but
But
ballparks will do.
it's like 25 to 30 or more percent of more CO2 is going to be emitted in the process of this whole of generating the energy to run the equipment to compress and
Right.
store the. So right off the bat, even if you were capturing and storing 100% of the emissions coming out of the smokestack, you're cutting down
More
30%
trees to
trees
power your carbon
to
capture and
power it.
storage.
So then, and of course, the key difference with CCS, carbon capture and storage for fossil fuels versus bioenergy is that if you do it at a fossil fuel plant, you had CO2 coming out of the smokestack. Now you're going to capture that and park it below ground. So you've turned a plant that was emitting carbon into a zero emissions plant. If it works perfectly 100% in theory, right? That's so you've gone from all your emissions entering the atmosphere to none. So you're now a zero emissions plant. The claim with bioenergy, however, is not that you're going to become a zero emissions plant because remember, they're already
You're
claiming to
already
be.
a zero emissions plant in their
So
fantasy land.
rather than claiming that they're net zero emissions already, they say that when you park that CO2 below ground, now they're actually negative
Negative
emissions.
emission.
is sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. But of course, this is bogus. And the fact that policymakers haven't seen through this, I mean, it's like honestly, I feel like policymakers who are endorsing this are like, "Hi, I don't get it.
I
I'm going
know,
to announce to the
exactly.
world how like
Well, how many policymakers have you met who had two functioning neurons that were actually talking to each other? I mean,
well,
seriously,
lots of
honestly.
people are smart and they would never fall for this. If this were like a financial scheme, they would never fall for this, right?
You sure?
I mean,
They've
I
fallen
don't
for quite a lot of
try.
financial schemes. We have a government that
Well,
paid people $440 billion, pounds, sorry, to cut up black bin bags and sell them back to us as PPE during the COVID
oh
pandemic.
yeah.
So,
Okay. Okay.
they're
Yeah, you
not the
win that round.
smartest people on the planet.
But I
Um,
mean, the idea that it's negative emissions. So remember, the tree. Say you've got a tree that's 150 years old. The tree has been sequestering carbon and sucking carbon out of the atmosphere for 150 years, right? All that carbon removal from the atmosphere already happened. You
yep.
cut down
Yes.
the tree,
Yes.
you
Release
burn
all
the
the
tree,
carbon.
capture the CO2, and put that CO2 below ground. You have not removed any new CO2 from the
No,
atmosphere.
no,
You've
absolutely.
simply prevented CO2 that was already captured from entering the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And that's not negative
No,
emissions.
no,
That's
no.
zero emissions.
Surely.
And
Also,
this is so basic. This is
yeah,
so
yeah,
basic
it's basic
that for
arithmetic. It's like
policymakers
3-year-olds
to
could do it.
continue endorsing this, it's like announcing to the world how stupid they are.
Yeah.
And I cannot believe that policymakers are willing to like go on the record as being that sort of mass illiterate about the most basic things about climate, about what constitutes a positive emission, a negative emission, or a neutral emission. It's the most basic thing that you need to understand. And so for any Minister of Energy and Climate to be endorsing this as offering negative emissions, it's like an immediately disqualifying.
Mm,
Hopefully, the new Labor government, before they go on the record saying anything stupid about endorsing
too
this
late.
as their ongoing policy, hopefully they'll take a good look at the science and
Mm.
figure out
Yeah.
on their very own that it's not going to work and
Yeah,
that throwing
don't
money at
hold your
it,
breath.
throwing billions and
Yeah.
billions of pounds more additional at this is a colossal waste of money and time
But they're
and
going to
people.
have the lobbyists, because that was something that really struck me when I heard you before, was the amount of lobbying that happens. And they're going to have lobbyists who are basically very good at the 3-cup game, aren't they? They're going to be, let me put a little bit of CO2 under these cups. I'm going to move all the cups around and you have to guess where the CO. Oh, look, it's all gone. And
It's your job as a policymaker to see through that.
yeah, I know, but
That's supposedly the best and the brightest, right? Like
I know.
all
I
those
don't think
public
that's what the
school
system does.
graduates, all those Oxford, Cambridge grads.
Yeah.
What
Ed
did you
Miliband
do?
is really smart, I think, and he really gets it, but I'm not sure they have the bandwidth, to be perfectly honest. I think by the time you got
Something
to be a
takes
Secretary of
5 minutes
State,
to explain.
you would think.
And
So
once
so this is
you
my
see it, you
question.
can't unsee it.
So when you explain this, when you get someone and you sit them down and you look them in the eye and you point out the really basic arithmetic of this, do you watch the pennies drop and the little lights going on in their heads and the moment of epiphany? Has that happened in your company? And if not, why not?
Well, I mean, I think it happens with people that I'm talking to, but I'm not like toe to toe with high level policymakers.
Okay.
It's like so. I
We
mean,
need to get you toe to toe
we've
with them.
sort of given up trying to convince anyone, and we've just turned to the courts. We've resorted to the courts, basically.
Okay.
We're having that conversation by filing litigation, and because we file litigation,
Then they pay
Lightscape
attention.
Lightscape being the plaintiff in this case, but us helping um, because of discovery, because of the documents that we get to see kind of the back end of the government's thinking on this, what they're saying. Some, we're privy to some of that
Okay.
stuff, and it's really clear that they've come up with like 5 different explanations about why bioenergy is zero carbon, and some of them are mutually incompatible, and they just don't seem to care. At least the conservative government didn't seem to
No, no, of
care,
course not. No.
and they seem to assume that they're just gonna have total impunity and that they can just, um, misrepresent this. And, I've seen question time, like parliamentary question time, and the same thing where they're just lying right into the
Yes.
faces of the MPs.
Yes.
And they know they're lying and they do it anyway.
Yep.
And, I think if this were, it just shows how deeply unserious they are about addressing climate. Because if this were any other issue where they were lying at the same level, say it was like, say it was about like, nuclear power and the danger of like a really dangerous meltdown or something, people wouldn't stand for it. But it's just carbon,
Mm.
you know,
Yes. And we can make it go away by wishing it wasn't there. And then look, we've got zero carbon
right.
and it's all China's fault.
Like you said, shuffling the cups around or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
But I mean, I wish that carbon dioxide was like dark purple or something,
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
it came smokestack and persisted, because like it's just the fact that it's invisible, odorless. It's really,
And
really
I had
problematic.
someone look me in the eye and say, well, it's only 450 parts per million. That's a tiny amount. It can't be doing anything.
Oh,
So
yeah.
let's not.
Don't even bother
No,
engaging
no,
with
it's not.
people.
But
Just take
one thing
yourself.
that I thought was an interesting, I listened to Tom Cho, who's clearly a man with a brain the size of many planets, who worked out there's some very, very, very expensive billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar carbon capture and storage plant in the US, which of course is not actually capturing anything yet, and will take many decades to cover the carbon release of the concrete that built it. And he reckoned 200 beavers would sequester the same amount of carbon. And the only reason that's not being counted is that nobody has found a way to monetize beavers yet. So I
Right.
just think you should be using a beaver as a unit of carbon accounting. This is how much a beaver can sequester. Look, we put 10 beavers
Yeah.
at the head of river in your area. They'll sequester just as much carbon as
Yeah.
Drax, and it's not
Well,
costing you anything.
Europe is trying to, it's too bad about Brexit because
Hmm.
Europe has got some
On
great
so many
ideas.
levels. Sorry,
Nature
go on. Europe.
restoration.
Is Europe
Well,
beginning
I
to
mean,
listen? Because they had some pretty fancy false accounting too.
oh, they do. I mean, they're still totally out to lunch on bioenergy, but they do have the land use change forestry regulation, LULUCF, yeah, which is setting targets for each member state to sequester more carbon in the land sector. And they're very unambitious targets, but the fact that they have set targets and then the nature restoration legislation. So
Right.
these things are really we really need to address in policies explicitly that um it's kind of it gratifyingly it's kind of what you would expect. Old, big, complex ecosystems store a hell of a lot of carbon.
Right.
And it's just as important to prevent that carbon from entering the atmosphere in the future as it is to incentivize new carbon entering into ecosystems. Fortunately, we can do both because, as I
Sometimes at the
said,
same time.
many forests have such low carbon density that changes in forest management could renaturalize and store a lot more carbon in existing forests. And then the forests that are still relatively intact, the old growth, the primary, we need to leave them hell alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stay the hell out of them.
Right. Okay. In a minute, I want to ask you about how we could design good policy, but let's take a slight step to the side and look at the other biomass concepts, which seems, as far as I can tell, to be growing various forms of grasses, bundling them up, transporting them long distances, and then burning them in a power station and saying, "Look, we just sucked it out of the air in a single year." So basically,
Mhm.
that also again is worth zero. And I'm assuming that, well, it seems to me equally false accounting. And is there anything that I'm missing in the fact that this is just basically untrue? Are there any, since the transport
It
costs, in the
seems
end, the
great on
transport costs
paper.
must be huge.
Yeah.
Right.
It seems great on paper because the year life cycle of a grass, and particularly if it's a perennial grass where the root mass is staying intact and storing more carbon in soils, etc. In theory, this can, serve um as a low carbon source of fuel. But the problem is you need to look at scaling issues, and the amount of fuel and carbon that you can get off of any given area of land is really small.
Right.
You need massive, massive amounts of land to grow enough grasses to make into fuel to power, produce any reasonable amount of power. And then on top of that, so then you have like, well, where are we going to get that land?
Hmm.
Right.
What
So
else
we're going
might it
to
be
take it
used for?
away. Are we going to grow less food? Are
Exactly.
we going to tell people that, we should be doing less animal agriculture? Personally, I think we should be doing less animal agriculture for lots of reasons. That would have a huge climate benefit to do less animal agriculture. But anyway, the bottom line is there's just not massive amounts of land. And then
And
people
also
say,
water.
well, we'll use abandoned land. But the thing is, if it's abandoned for a reason. It may be very low productivity. You can't just go in, you need water and nutrients to
Yeah.
grow a crop.
Yeah. And
Particularly
what
if
you
you're
don't want is to be having enormous combine harvesters, which have their own embodied
right,
carbon and are chewing through diesel and spreading glyphosate and nitrogen and phosphates, which are
right.
more
And
of
then
the boundaries
and
that
then
we
you
break.
have to process the material into a fuel. And it turns
Yes.
out that actually miscanthus, switchgrass and all these things are not that great a fuel. Like they have a lot of it's it turns into it's called ash even before it's burned and turned into ash, but inorganic components like silica and
Right.
different components besides carbon. So they make a lot of ash. They're sort of low energy density. They're kind of a pain in the ass to process. You got to chew up massive, you have to dry it, you have to chew it up, you have to pelletize it, then you have to move it all over the place. And most of that takes fossil fuels or
I see.
biofuels, liquid biofuels that have also been produced at great carbon cost. So there's just, there's
The energy
ultimately
return cannot be
the
great.
energy return is,
Oh,
diminished.
negative. I can't imagine. We have somebody local to here, and she's lovely, and it's all organic, and they're trying to do their best, and they're growing miscanthus, and then the
Right.
only place it can be processed is in Norfolk, which is absolutely as far as you can get away from us in England without falling into the sea. And by the time they've cut it, baled it, transported it across there, turned it into something you could actually put into a power station, I cannot believe that you have any net positive gain at all.
Well, and
At
it just
plus.
becomes really expensive too. Even if you do have a net gain, the amount of carbon that is involved in transport and stuff is still relatively small percentage of the
Okay.
carbon that's embodied in the fuel. But it just is really expensive. Do
Yeah.
all that stuff. And people don't want their electricity price to double.
No.
And if you are going to double their price, do it because you're building solar or
Yeah.
whatever.
Or something else.
Don't do it for some dumb combustion based, technology. Combustion is so yesterday. Because on top of
Yeah.
the carbon problems, you've got, of course, conventional pollutant emissions. None of this
Right.
stuff is cleanly. And
Right.
then you have tons of like literally tons of ash left over that you have to get rid of.
What do
So
you
they're
do with that?
spreading on fields. It's like,
Right.
well, now that might not be so good for the field.
Depending what's in it. Right. So what
Right.
does happen to the ash? Do they just literally go out and spread it, or do they do landfill with the ash that
Some
they
of it
just
gets landfilled,
ah
some of it gets spread.
well,
Yeah. It's just a
okay.
gigantic exercise in moving carbon and waste around.
Yeah. Right. So let's pretend that the incoming government called you up and said, Mary, we would like a strategy that's sensible and wise. What would you if they made you some kind of, I don't know, energy production czar, which is they like to think that they're all Russian. Don't ask me why. Um, what would you what would you say? What would your strategy be?
Um, I mean, I don't make any claim to being this. I'm very narrowly specialized in this one area, so I don't claim to have some
Let's
broad
play.
vision.
Have some, yeah, but you
But
must have some idea.
well, I mean, the first thing they need to do, which of course they'll never do, but they need to stop lying to people. They need to be honest about where we're at with the climate crisis and what's going to be required to actually address and to move to a low carbon energy system. And it's going to require a lot more. And then they've just got to double down on energy efficiency. You know, houses need to be made more efficient so that you don't have to expend so much to heat them. And then electrify everything.
That
Everything
can
needs
be
to be
electrified. Right.
that can be electrified.
But that's going to
Um,
take huge amounts of copper. I had somebody else on the podcast a while ago, Dr. Simon Misha, who said that if the EU went ahead with its net zero concepts, we have over the lifetime of humanity, we mined something like 800 million tons of copper. I might be an order of magnitude out there. We would need to mine the same amount in the next 22 years just for the EU to
mm,
electrify everything they want to electrify. And there isn't. That's not possible. It takes 10 years to find a new copper mine. 1 in 10 of them survives. And then it takes another 10 years and a lot of fossil fuels to get the stuff out of the ground. And it's not there. We can't electrify everything.
right. Well, looks like we're
So
all going to be
learning to
on
live with,
beachfront property and a lot warmer in the future then.
yeah.
Because
And
if
and doing
people want
without air
to continue
conditioning.
yeah, if people want to continue with the same standard of living or anything close to it, we have to emit a lot less. I mean,
Everything.
first of all, we can't continue at the same rate of resource extraction, but um, life is becoming unlivable for some people
Oh, for
already,
lots of people around the globe. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
because of extreme heat.
Yeah.
And
And the wildfires.
yeah,
I mean, you're in the whole of North
we're
America
reaching
seems to be.
tipping points. So people need to wrap their heads around that, and then they need to figure out, um, how to do all of this without burning stuff. It's burning stuff that got us into this mess. We are not going to burn our way out of the climate crisis.
Yeah.
It-
There is no carbon capture and storage
Grass,
possible.
trees, none of it.
Yeah.
Fossil fuels, it's all carbon into the atmosphere and it needs to stop.
Yeah. Well,
So, yeah,
okay. Tell us just
sorry.
before we end. No, it's true. I mean, this podcast says this all the time. And I am wondering with the wildfires in Canada and the US, whether their governments will then stop drags. We've just lost however many millions of acres of trees, which have just belted all their carbon into the atmosphere. So you guys are
Right.
just not going to get to cut any more trees and burn them as well. Is that even a
Yeah.
sequential series of logical processes
No,
that happens?
not from what I've seen. The BC government,
Right.
they'll just say, see, we told you these wildfires, they're just going to burn everything anyway. So we might as well cut down these trees and burn
And
them for
sell them
energy.
to people for lots of money, that some of which happens
That's what
to
they'll
come to
say.
the people making the decisions. I mean,
That's what Drax said. If you watch that BBC, the green energy scandal exposed, that came out a couple of years ago, but about Drax logging and primary forest in BC. This is one of the things that they say is, oh, this is all fire prone, and it's
what?
these beautiful healthy forests. Well, they're gonna burn, so we better cut them down.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I try. I realize it doesn't sound like this to people who listen to this podcast often, but I do try to feel and think the best of people. But it's getting quite hard in this particular
No,
circumstance.
trust me, if you watch this, the Drax executive who lies right into the face of Joe Crowley, the reporter who did the investigation, he's a bad guy. He'll
Is he still in post? That you
ambiguously.
know?
Who?
Is he still in post? Is he still there?
I don't know.
Don't know.
I hope.
Okay. All right. We're gonna have to
Yeah.
stop shortly because I kept you in for an hour. I'm just very curious before we go of how the litigation is going anywhere in the world. Are you having success with courts going, yes, this is obviously scandalous, we need to stop? Is that a thing?
Well, as much as a non-lawyer, I would like to believe that litigation is this magic bullet. I'm always like, let's just sue them. See, I'm terrible, like litigious American, the stereotypical.
Might
But
be hard.
I want it to be something fast. It's not fast. It takes a long time. We filed the case in the EU. We helped a French lawyer file the case. Clementine Beldon, it's her case. Against the European Commission. We just found out recently that we actually did get oral arguments. So the Court of Justice will be hearing an oral argument. So that's a
Okay.
step forward. Like it's got moved beyond just shuffling papers back and forth. There's an actual
Okay.
date
As
at the
somebody
court.
gets to hear you talk, that's got to be a good thing.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Do you go and give evidence? Is that part of your role in this?
it's not going to be that sort of a hearing, but I
Okay.
already put in written evidence. So,
Okay.
and then the UK stuff is sort of grinding forward slowly. We update whenever we can on our website, which is forestlitigation.org, has an
I'll put that in the
overview of
show notes.
all the cases that we're involved in.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I spoke a couple of weeks ago to Jojo Beta of Stop Ecocide International. She and Polly Higgins set it up. And she is hopeful that if the crime of ecocide is taken up by the EU, and apparently they've just passed something which references an ecocide-like behaviour, that becomes criminal action. And then the CEOs of companies can be put into actual jail.
But the
And that,
definition of ecocide is fairly narrow.
okay, so I
My
was wondering,
understanding of that it's the deliberate destruction of an ecosystem for the sake of destroying it, not necessarily as a byproduct of extractive activities.
but if
So
it, right, okay, all right. So you don't, so I was hoping that maybe Drax could be done for ecocide. You don't think that's fairly,
I've been following that a little bit because I actually met I had the good fortune to meet Judge Pokar, who helped Stop Ecocide formulate some of
right,
the thinking on that case, and
right,
I've sort of been following that issue a little
okay,
bit. And I was like, "Oh yeah, it's such a great concept, everything." But then
right.
when you really zero in,
Not
you
taken.
realize it's fairly narrowly defined. But I mean, I wish them all the best, and I hope it goes forward.
Right. So
We
it's more
need to
for things like oil spills that are obviously accidental
well, and also I
catastrophic
think there's an element of it needing to be deliberate.
or due to negligence. I got the impression from
Yeah.
Jojo that the Deepwater Horizon would have counted because
Okay.
there was obvious
Yeah.
negligence.
Right.
It's retrospective and that
Yeah.
can't happen. But if it were to happen after the law is passed, then they would
Yeah.
definitely give it a go. Um, Curses. Well, I mean, what Drax is doing is completely deliberate, and it is destroying entire
True. But
ecosystems.
logging, the thing about bioenergy and logging is that it's really I'm not in any way trying to downplay it because bioenergy is the only time that we're logging and saying it's like zero carbon or whatever. But um with policies deliberately trying to increase it. But bioenergy logging is really only a fraction of the total logging that happens
Okay.
around. And
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah. Okay. All right, my lovely. Thank you. I would,
yeah.
it
Yeah.
has been a joy, although it is still deeply distressing. But the more people that know about this, then obviously the more people that we can begin to apply pressure. Is there any way that people listening, 50% in the UK, the other 50% around the world, is there any way that we can help? Is there anything useful that listeners can do?
Um, there's, I mean, other than intervening with policymakers and becoming educated about this issue, which sounds like a complicated issue, but it's really not. It's just grow forests, don't burn them.
Yeah. Right.
Uh, that's what we need
Yeah.
for nature restoration and saving the climate.
Yeah.
Save trees, save the climate. And so, anyone who cares about this issue, I mean, of course, they're welcome to get in touch with us through the Forest Litigation Collaborative website,
Yeah.
um, pfpi.net, which is our website.
Yeah. I
There's
put
also,
those in the show notes already, so they're
yeah.
already there. People
We
can
also
see it.
run another website called forestdefenders.eu um, that will soon be forestdefenders.org. Um, so there's various ways to get in touch with us if you're interested in learning more about policies around the world and how to get involved.
Okay. Brilliant.
Yeah.
I will put everything in the show notes, and anybody listening who's keen, this
Yeah.
is a good area to become really well educated and be able to stand up, because once you've got it, it's really clear.
Yeah.
And
People
it
just
seems
need to
maybe you get
fight
talk to
for
people.
us.
Yeah.
Fight for forest, no matter how small a bit of forest it is, even if it's just a tiny little park or whatever. Fight
Yeah.
for forests.
Fight for your big old trees as well.
Trees are the salvation of the planet. They really are, and of us.
Yes.
Yeah.
Brilliant. That's a very beautiful note to end on. Mary,
Yeah.
thank you for coming on to
Thank
the
you.
Accidental Gods podcast
Okay.
and your cats.
Yes, always.